Good morning, afternoon or evening everybody, wherever you are. I'm Bryan Howard from Sheffield in UK. I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes, and then what I'll do is to draw breath and encourage you to ask questions or make comments at that stage. Until then, I would be grateful if you didn't interrupt me unless there's something that I've said that's not clear to you. If that's the case, then please request clarification, but I do need to admit that this is a new format for me, and I apologize now if I miss your request for clarification. Right, the topic today then is certifying competence, and where I want to begin with this is really to take it into three phases. We're going to focus initially on what I mean by competence, and then we're going to look at ways in which that can be measured and the strengths and weaknesses of those methods. And then I'm going to explore the consequences of that for the certification of competence, if that's okay with you. Right, so the first stage that I want to move on to then is what do we mean by competence? And I'm going to deal with this from a number of different perspectives, as I've said. First of all, the European Directive 2010-83 EU introduces a number of important concepts, and amongst those is a clear emphasis on competence. The difficulty with this is that specifically it requires appropriate prior education and training to those who care for or kill or use animals for a scientific purpose, and in addition to those who design procedures in which animals will be used. And these require, or all of these categories, apart from the last one of those, requires appropriate supervision until competence has been established. This, therefore, is going to focus very much on those sort of characteristics arising out of the European Directive, but I will make it much more general because there are issues that we're dealing with here who've got a much more global implication than those that I've simply summarized there. The definition of competence that we've got here, used by the EU Skill in Lifelong Learning glossary, is that there are four parts to it: cognitive, functional, personal, and ethical. I guess one could chop it up in many different ways, but that is a convenient way of making sure that we don't miss out too much of what we're dealing with. Commonly we think of functional competence as being the ability to do a job, but you'll see from this that there are additional aspects that we also need to take into account. The emphasis on competence arises from a number of different considerations, which include satisfying concerns in the public about animal well-being, and that's an issue which is arising in many parts of the world now as animal rights activity increases in intensity. There are also issues in relation to scientific rigour, because obviously if an experiment is performed by competent people, it can be considered to be much more likely to have scientific rigour, and therefore to produce a more appropriate scientific result, which will not bring disrepute into the biological sciences. And finally, it facilitates the movement of personnel from one arena to another, and that's a topic that I'll come back to later on. Although the directive doesn't actually define what it means by competence, there's no shortage of definitions elsewhere. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm intending to draw a distinction between the words competence and competency, with a Y at the end. The latter, competency, relates to the deployment of a set of related knowledge, skills and abilities to successfully perform a function. The focus is on the defined work setting. In contrast, I'll use the word competence, or in plural competencies, in a much broader context that encompasses demonstrable outputs of both performance and behaviour, and this may relate to a system or set of minimum standards required for effective performance. So competence encompasses not only technical skill and deep understanding of the rationale for actions that are being taken, but much wider awareness of and sensitivity to societal interest in what's being done. This includes an ability to respond to the unexpected in a scientifically and ethically appropriate way, in other words, to handle emergencies effectively, to work professionally and effectively with colleagues, so that the output is in fact a joined-up output rather than single inputs, and to maintain high personal and workplace standards. So we can see competence then as lying in the centre of a group of activities relating around core knowledge and knowledge at a greater depth, meaning understanding and awareness of what's happening and an ability to use that information in developing strategies. But it also includes professionalism, ethical considerations, manual and technical skills, and resourcefulness. In other words, drawing on inner understandings of issues that might be arising in order to take things forward. And so how are these competencies going to be developed then? And we can see that there are a number of levels of competence that are shown in the table here. Starting off simply with knowledge. And knowledge is what you learn by reading through a text. Subsequent to that, there is understanding, is appreciating what that knowledge means. The next stage is application of that knowledge, the ability to use the information in order to solve a particular problem. There is then a wider requirement for synthesis, whereby the knowledge is used not only in that holistic sense, but also as a means of developing new ideas and new concepts and taking those forward. And finally, the deepest levels, if you like, of learning are those which relate to the evaluation of strategies. So not only can you develop strategies, but also you can think back, how is this strategy going to be beneficial, or is it going to work, or does it have shortcomings? And to select from a number of strategies any particular route forward. Now, many other qualities associated with competence are going to be acquired in the workplace rather than during the course of formal training. Although the quality of formal training is absolutely paramount in establishing a trajectory for individual personal development. I'm proposing to address in this talk not only the characteristics of that basic training, but the importance of continuing professional development, which means learning that takes place after the initial phases, if you like, of becoming competent, and including the need for guidance and structure as one moves down that list of depths of learning. Education and training is one way of developing some of the basic elements of competence, but it's not an end in itself. Firstly, there are other elements of competence, such as personal attributes, professionalism, the ability to work with others, are most unlikely to be developed in a formal didactic environment. There's also a need to select individuals before they engage with education and training to ensure that they are the sorts of people who are likely to be able to make best use of what's being presented to them. And if there are shortcomings identified, then they can be addressed in an appropriate way, or people, if it's felt that they're not likely to become competent in the sense that's required, they could have some alternative strategies presented to them for developing their careers. In addition, during the course of selection, if it's seen that there are shortcomings, in particular personal attitudes, then these can be addressed in other manners, perhaps by coaching or by some supervision mechanism. Often, education and prior experience are requirements for entrance to particular levels of activity within the laboratory animal science field. For example, the ALAT training in the United States or the UK Home Office require a certain level of background education and knowledge before they enter a formal training course. One reason for this is that individuals have sufficient background knowledge to enable them to assimilate information that is presented to them during formal training. And another reason is that it gives you an indication that those individuals are able to absorb information and to make use of it, because they've obviously demonstrated this already. Now, learning can take place in many different ways, and one of those, or one of the routes for developing learning is shown in this diagram here, which is developing competence beyond that initial training stage, and it's done by reflective learning. This is the Kolb learning cycle, where the learner carries out an action either under supervision or independently, because this can take place at any point in an individual's career. And then, having done that action, they reflect on how it went, shortcomings and strengths, and interpret why it went like that. So there's a great deal of thought here into what may seem to be a fairly simple deviation from normality. But of course, in a scientific context, scientists who are publishing papers and developing original research will already be carrying out this sort of process. The next phase then is to say, right, having interpreted what this means, I'm going to do things in a slightly different way to see if I can get a better outcome. And so you alter the way that you're approaching things and then move forward to a new cycle of activity in which hopefully your competence and abilities will generally improve. Another aspect of developing competency is the collegiate environment in which somebody is working. If somebody has got a functional role within a deeply caring and supportive community, they're much more likely to develop competence than they are if they're working individually or in a hostile environment where there are considerable frictions between individual researchers or individual care staff. We tend to call in UK, we call this culture a culture of care. It's a culture of mutual support in which the animal is in many ways central to the process, but individuals are working together in an attempt to ensure that the animal gets the best deal that's possible. Where an organization, or those responsible for overseeing the activities of people within such an organization, need to be fully plugged into that culture of care. They need to not only have bought into it, but they need to understand it and where sources of support come from. Initial learning and training in laboratory animal science is usually delivered through a standard curriculum. This is linked to a defined series of learning outcomes. The benefit of this is that it enables the student to identify what needs to come out of learning and helps them and the students to focus on the key issues, and it provides a yardstick for measuring learning and achievement. There's considerable uniformity in the learning outcomes that are identified by regulatory bodies and others in different countries. So that's encouraging. At least we have a core of expectation of what a competent individual will have. Both teachers and learners must have the same expectations on what they are supposed to address and how they're supposed to address them. And this can obviously vary at different times during the process of development of knowledge, education, training, and competence. And we need to bear in mind always that formal educational courses only deliver competency to carry out specific tasks. So there's a need for a variety of inputs in order to develop the rounded, competent individual. We also need to recognize that shortfalls in learning, which will inevitably occur, need to be identified and corrected during practice. Additional considerations include ensuring that the learner is prepared for the rigors of real working. In other words, an important part of this initial training is to make sure that the learner has got the skills necessary to continue the learning afterwards. I've talked about critical reflection and the importance of that, and I'll just carry on by emphasizing the fact that it's important that the learner can step back from events, examine their own performance, and draw conclusions from that which will be of a personal benefit. Effective training programs need to include an element of preparation for learning, as I've indicated just now, and some of that will work within the laboratory animal landscape in any case. For example, team working, developing the 3 R's, approaches towards ethics, management of critical incidents that will undoubtedly occur during the working life, and the development of key personal skills. Probably it's extremely useful to develop some of these skills alongside the workplace. In other words, you can have courses which are either intercalated amongst practical work experience, or you can get block release from a practical role in order to attend classes and then go back to carry out the practical classes within the lab. This sort of activity is used, for example, by the ALAT scheme for training animal caretakers and also by the Institute of Animal Technology. In fact, in some ways, the FALASA guidelines, the Federation of European Laboratory Animal Science Associations, for bench workers, bench scientific workers, recommend that the most appropriate way of training may well be an apprenticeship scheme, which takes the issue obviously considerably further forward. Key to following up this formal training is a period of developed competence, because I don't believe that an individual coming out of this formal training, as I said before, should be regarded as competent. They can be regarded as having a competency, but in themselves they need additional skills in order to be able to fulfill their role completely. And this usually involves a period of supervision, and that period of supervision has a number of aims. Firstly, to embed skills that have been learned in a classroom environment into formal activity. To provide for professional growth and development of the learner, in other words, to take that learning forwards as well as to embed it in practice. It's important to protect the welfare of animals so that they're not harmed by individuals during this process, and to keep a watchful eye on the performance of the learner in order to ensure that they're acting professionally and ethically. So learning in this context is an experimental process, and it provides a meaningful appreciation of issues that individuals are likely to meet later in life. Typically, those caring for and working with animals will be supervised by a more experienced colleague who is competent in the relative areas of work, often several colleagues competent in different areas so that they have skills which can be imparted from several angles. Both learner and supervisor need to feel comfortable with the arrangement. There need to be clear objectives, and ideally there should be a senior person who's out with this relationship who can monitor progress and draw up a schedule for tracking how the individual is developing. It helps the learner to become familiar with practical day-to-day workplace, and it develops formative working relationships with seniors with whom they may be collaborating subsequently. It also develops procedural time management skills, prioritization skills within an appropriate laboratory animal setting, and that's an important part of future career development. I want to move on now to examine some of the difficulties which will arise in terms of measuring competence. One thing that I have mentioned very briefly, and I will come back to it again, is that competence is not an all or none phenomenon. It doesn't mean I am competent or I'm not competent. I can be different, or there are different levels of competence that we can identify in different areas. But at the outset, we need to, before we start measuring, we need to identify what level of competence and in what areas we are seeking to make our measurements in order to satisfy legal, scientific, and ethical requirements. We'll discuss that again later. Partly, the decision as to where we're going to focus our emphasis will be determined by what is the effect of a shortfall in performance, because developing competence in people costs money and time and resources, and we don't want to do that if, in fact, it's not going to be of any benefit to us. We looked at some of the benefits earlier, but at this stage you would be saying, what would be the impact on my establishment if this individual is not competent? More practically, it's likely that you would carry out a cost-benefit assessment, and you will say, look, it's going to cost this much in terms of time, resources, people, space, and there is this much benefit coming from it, and you will perhaps modulate the amount of effort that you spend in developing that competence. When we come to the assessment process, we're going to have to look at a number of characteristics of that in order to ensure that we are able to find the appropriate requirement. So, for example, here in looking at practicality, we can say that is there sufficient resources in order to develop the program of competence that we have in mind? It may be that you can argue for more resources, it may be that they're not available, and therefore you need to look at a different way of developing competence. But in terms of assessment, that's going to be quite an important figure. We need to make sure that the assessment process itself is valid. In other words, how well does it measure the aspects of competence that you want to assess? It needs to be robust. It means that if you've got a number of different assessors, would they all come up with the same answer? How well will the results of the assessment reflect what the candidate is actually capable of doing? And finally, it needs to be consistent, so that measuring a number of individuals, all of whom are going to vary in slight respects from one way or another, that you come up with a consistent output, which everybody can have great faith in. My slides are moving around, I think. No, they're not. Right. So if we're going to be examining candidates in order to assess their stage of development, we first need to make sure that we cover the key issues at an appropriate depth and range. Questions that we ask need to be completely unambiguous, so that there is no issue of the learner not being sure what's required of them. We need to allow candidates plenty of opportunity to demonstrate whether they are outstanding, mediocre, or poor. They need to be fair, so that different candidates would achieve similar, or with similar levels of learning, would obtain a similar result. In other words, there must be no apparent bias because somebody who has focused on particular aspects of training but ignored others would do better than another who had perhaps focused on different areas. And of course, it needs to be practicable. It needs to be something that can be easily done and effectively done, as we've seen already. Now, the approaches currently available for the direct assessment of competence are inevitably unsatisfactory, particularly using the wider definition that I presented to you earlier. Obviously, it would be ethically unacceptable to deliberately create an unanticipated complication in the handling or scientific use of a laboratory animal. And because competence is a measure, if you like, of the ability of an individual to deal with such a situation in real life, that's an aspect of performance that we're not going to be able to measure easily. But in fact, all of the assessment strategies have got weaknesses and strengths, and very quickly I just want to run through some of those. First of all, we've seen that competence is a stage beyond competency. It doesn't just mean knowledge, and it doesn't just mean manual skill, but it means, or it incorporates those two functions, and we need to recognize that they can be assessed relatively easily. For example, often standards of competency are set by accrediting bodies or other regulatory authorities, and the appropriate education and training may be delivered by a number of providers who sometimes themselves participate in the assessment. For an example of that would be in the UK, where there are 3 different accrediting bodies authorised by the Home Office to provide training and assess people who have been trained. Now here we're dealing with competency and not competence. So each devolves education and training to individual training providers who also conduct assessments, and although they are doing this independently, there is some oversight of the standards within a particular accrediting group. The accreditation scheme offered by FLASA similarly focuses on the quality of provision of education rather than the outcomes of education. And in fact, that is a fault, I think, of most accreditation processes that we have at the present time, is that they are looking much more at the quality of input rather than the quality of output. Not true, that's not true of all, of course, and the ALAT scheme is, if you like, a measure of output, but the FLASA scheme itself falls slightly short on that measure. Models such as those I've just outlined provide flexibility in the preparation of personnel for examination, but inevitably there are varying levels of prescription of the way in which competency is assessed. I just want to provide a word of warning at this stage, and that is the tendency of those who are delivering and assessing training to look at the issues as a number of modules. And I fear this is an issue that's going to arise with the new European directive, because the requirement there is for people to have completed a number of modules. And the danger with modules is that training at all these different levels tends to compartmentalize learning, and many of the strategies for assessment reinforce that compartmentalization, so that learning is piecemeal and the quality of learning is therefore potentially compromised. And while a particular training program or national accreditation body can consciously or unconsciously buy into this process, it needs to be realized that there is, if you like, a compartmentalization taking place, and somehow this needs to be unbundled. And then one way of doing that is, of course, during supervision at the end of the training period. In general, excuse me, after the written or after the formal training of this sort, students are assessed by written examination. These vary widely in format, and perhaps the commonest is the multiple choice question, which can vary from a simple yes-no or true-false selection to selection of a truist statement from amongst a number of others. But of course there are quite a number of different strategies, and some of those are listed on this slide here. So we have multiple choice or true-false questions, and that's the sort that I've just described, or extended matching questions, in which a number of scenarios are presented and the person being assessed is required to pick the most likely scenario from a number of others in response to a particular prompt. There may be short answer questions, longer essay questions, which may be open book or closed book. People may be required to complete projects. There may be oral presentations, which are quite common, for example, at a PhD level, and then preparation of portfolios. So a whole range of potential strategies for assessing knowledge, and these vary in their ability to assess the higher levels of knowledge that we looked at earlier. One problem with multiple choice questions is that they're very difficult to set, and it can be very difficult to make them good measures of deep learning. On the other hand, if we move down this list, coming down in this direction here, we find that the preparation of portfolios is a very good way of measuring the ability of somebody to put information together and to structure it in a way that demonstrates deeper levels of understanding and perhaps also synthesis and selection. But on the other hand, as we move down this list, it becomes increasingly difficult to actually mark objectively the outcome of that assessment. A multiple choice question, you will finish up with a number, and that will tell you how many correct selections were made. In the case of a portfolio, there's a lot of opinion goes into that as to precisely whether or not it meets standards. And of course these standards can be defined, but nonetheless two people marking the same portfolio will quite possibly come up with rather different marks for that portfolio, and this can lead to a lack of consistency. Another aspect of the process, of course, is the ability to mark and to provide feedback on different assessment methods. And I think here we're going to have to realize that whatever we're going to be doing, it's not going to be a watertight solution to understanding how much a student knows and understands. Moving down the list that I was discussing just now, so let's come back to this one. As I've said, easy to set the questions. It's easy to ask somebody just to produce a portfolio about your performance as a bench scientist, successes you've had, things that have gone wrong and how you've dealt with those, but much more difficult to make a multiple choice exam. Much more difficult, however, to be precise as to the scoring that you would give here, and therefore we can see that there's, if you like, a cost-benefit assessment in the way that we would move down those. It's much more difficult to objectively assess deeper levels of understanding. And we need to realize that we need different strategies for doing this. Although the portfolio may provide a way in, there are shortcomings in the portfolio. It may happen that the learner finds it more difficult to appreciate the information and the learning that's taken place. And therefore somebody who's slick at putting together information will appear to have an advantage over somebody who is, if you like, less acquainted with the portfolio system of examination. Another difficulty that we have, of course, is in the assessment of practical skills, and we'll look at those a little bit later on, but there are techniques available for reasonably objectively managing or assessing bench skills. But again, there are shortcomings as well with many of those. Just a number of quick points about the examination process, such as we've laid it out in these slides. And first is to make sure that the process is robust, so that it produces the same result if marked by different examiners, and if different students with the same knowledge took the same assessment form, they would produce the same results. People being assessed need to know precisely what skills and criteria or judgment are being used. The examiner ideally should not be the trainer. You want a fresh pair of eyes looking at the assessment process. And often there is benefit, particularly in the case of practical assessments, in ensuring that the examiner not only looks at how a student is demonstrating practical skills, but also is able to score these in an objective way using a check sheet or a mark box, and in addition may ask a few oral questions to better understand whether the student has a good grasp of what he or she is doing. Where you've got a number of assessors, as you are likely to have if you're dealing with a practical examination, or a large number of students dealing with a written examination, then it's quite important that there should be some sort of quality control between the assessors to make sure that the assessment standards are uniform. Learning acquired in other ways can be much more difficult to follow. I'm thinking here, for example, of e-learning assessments, where a student has carried out quite a lot of learning online, and the formal types of examinations we've looked at can be applied, but are generally more difficult and less robust. And what we might do there is to look for e-assessment techniques, and there are a number of those which we can deploy, particularly beneficial in a sense if they're dealing with longer essay-type questions or portfolio collections, is the availability of anti-plagiarism software, which can be used to check that this is a student's original work. And also e-technology can be used to support a learner during the process of learning. For example, by providing online feedback through a Dropbox, where a student submits a piece of work, it's marked, and goes back into the Dropbox, and the student can re-access it and get immediate feedback about the performance. Learning acquired alongside an experienced animal caretaker or bench scientist involves the integration of manual skills, as we've seen, with knowledge and understanding, and that can be assessed at the time when the student is at the bench or in the animal facility, but it can be difficult to quantify, as we've already seen. Often it's the supervisor who assesses the competence of their supervisees, and so there needs to be clear guidance as to precisely what those criteria will be, because obviously there will be different supervisors working with different supervisees, but there needs to be that level of consistency that I've referred to before. There are difficulties because of interpersonal relationships that may arise between supervisor and supervisees. A supervisor may have a student they've got very little confidence in, and even if the student performs well, they may be disinclined to award a good mark. It's often better to have an independent person or an independent body to review attainment against predefined measures. In other words, external to this close supervision process, there is another layer, if you like, of examination to make sure that the examiners are working to a common format. Such an arrangement is facilitated under the new European directive because there's a requirement there for establishments to identify somebody to ensure that staff are adequately educated, competent, and continuously trained. Central assessment of this sort also simplifies identification of persons who are deemed competent to supervise, in other words, more advanced individuals, and they can be taken forward to deal with more complex activities. But assessment at this stage has to be much more holistic than simply looking at examination results. We must also incorporate into this a mechanism for recognizing competencies which have been developed outside a formal program. For example, veterinarians and surgeons may be skilled in tasks such as the administration of compounds or the conduct of surgery, but they may not fully appreciate the differences between laboratory animals and larger farm animals, for example, or pet animals, or on the other hand of human subjects. We need to recognize that prior learning may be incomplete or biased, and so we may need to provide an explanation about things in a different context. And one of the challenges is to recognize that learners, almost by definition, come from a wide range of different backgrounds, and when we come to measure competence, we need to be allowing for the learning that's taken place in other places. Okay, so then how are we going to actually make sure that we have a scheme which will successfully certificate the competence of individuals? First, I've indicated that we need to recognize there are different areas of competence, and in this somewhat dramatic picture, if you like, we've got a number of individuals, each of whom has got specific competences. I'd like to think that each of those can do their own job better than anybody else in that group. Surely the surgeon should be a better surgeon, the anaesthetist should be a better anaesthetist, or the anesthesiologist, if we're going to use American terminology. The circulating nurse, or would be the theatre nurse, would be using a different set of skills from those which probably the surgeon would easily deploy. And so each of the persons in that picture is competent, but each of them is competent at a slightly different thing, but all of them are working in a surgical theatre. And I think that's something we need to bear in mind when we're looking at what we mean by areas of competence. It's not often recognized. The other thing that we need to make sure is that people can develop competence to deeper levels. We've been talking mainly about the learner who is at a relatively early stage in development, but that person will hopefully, having just achieved a basic competence, be able to move forward to become an assistant surgeon and subsequently to become the chief surgeon responsible for the management of the surgical program. And so what we have got here is not only competence in different areas, but competence at different levels. And that, as I've said, is something which very frequently is overlooked, and we don't give ourselves sufficient latitude to be able to deal with that. In a sense, the European directive, for its shortcomings in terms of speaking a great deal about competence, but not actually telling us what they mean by that, does recognize in this diagram that somebody who has completed their formal training program is not yet competent. They come through here, they come to a stage when they acquire additional information, whether they're care staff or whether they are bench scientists, but then they develop their competence, continue to develop competence on a lifelong scale. So even within the directive, which appears to have shortcomings, there is in fact a clear way forward in terms of identifying competences. Any accreditation scheme for flexibility or any certification scheme requires to accommodate these varying levels of competence. Individual establishments will undoubtedly prefer a particular deployment of personnel at each level. Depends partly on finance. It depends partly on the management structure within the establishment and the type of research activities that may be taking place. So a certification scheme needs to be sufficiently well drafted to make it clear precisely what the requirements are and what has been certified. And that needs to be reflected in any documentation that's issued. I've also indicated that the scheme would need to accommodate expertise developed and accredited elsewhere. And this includes by not only e-learning, but international or multinational organizations, associations and companies. For example, an experienced researcher in the United States should have their expertise recognized if they wish to relocate and work in the European Union, or vice versa. However, the expertise which they bring with them when they travel is frequently not recognized, and such people are required to undertake a training program. That is crazy, because they already have many of the skills that the training program is trying to impart at a much higher and deeper level. But in addition to that, there's a great deal of material they certainly don't need. They do need to become acquainted with local legal and regulatory processes, but most of the training that they will receive in this way is irrelevant. Now, at the European level, some flexibility may be coming along because of the proposal to formally recognize a number of different accrediting bodies and to monitor their activity with a broad European platform which will have oversight of what's taking place there. The accreditation scheme operated by FOLASA, it's been in place now for more than 10 years, demonstrates that even higher educational establishments are becoming more receptive these days to external and indeed transnational validation and accreditation of their activities. Often, people from unconventional backgrounds, as I've already indicated, are required to undertake formal educational training, and that is completely unnecessary. Although we've seen that learning outcomes are widely used in modern curriculum development, they've unfortunately not yet been properly incorporated into instruments of assessment. However, if we see them as building blocks of competence, we see them as blocks, if you like, of development, then it is possible to use learning outcomes as a measure of prior learning, learning in different places. For example, an agricultural worker who's coming to work in a research facility, working perhaps with agricultural animals, could have their existing skills recognized. And that can be done if we build our assessment process around learning outcomes rather than teaching inputs. We need flexibility without sacrificing standards. However, as long as validation and certification remains at a national level, individual learners are assessed against highly variable standards, speaking at an international level. So what is needed is, if you like, more uniformity and a coming together of standards in different parts of the world. As I said before, there's currently too much emphasis on basic knowledge and skills and too little on attitudes. And for me, the underlying personal skills such as ethical awareness, curiosity, critical and analytical skills, flexibility, professionalism are much more important in context of competence than are the basic things which are frequently tested. Too often, accreditation and certification is based on a checklist methodology, but we need to find ways of developing those competencies in an environment to which I've referred earlier as a culture of care. Deeper levels of learning are obviously much more difficult to assess, but nonetheless, there are ways of approaching them. One of those ways is to use the bird's eye view, in which there are multiple mini audits of the learner, similar to a 360-degree appraisal process, and these can focus on things such as welfare, planning, preparation, record keeping, interpretation, and ideas for change. So that by asking a number of different individuals who are working with this person in different contexts for their views on a number of items of this sort, it's possible to form a holistic view of how competent that individual is. Another approach to assessing higher level learning is the focused review, which can be written or oral, and it can focus on the activities of the individual concerned by getting them to reflect on things that they've done, similar to a portfolio, but going beyond that, and holistically reviewing the opportunities that this presents for moving forward. And a third method that could be used is that an assessor might actually watch the learner during a particularly demanding task in the workplace. A bench scientist carrying out a tricky piece of work, or somebody designing a study, sitting with them while they're putting the study together, and this person then has an opportunity to ask questions about the way things are being done. They may provide guidance or even supervision if that's necessary to secure animal welfare, but at the end of the process they can assign a score, which unfortunately is likely to be qualitative rather than quantitative, but nonetheless gives a possibility of developing a marking scheme. The difficulty with all these systems, of course, is that there is a need for moderation, because none of them are completely objective, and that is inevitably going to be a problem at this level. Increasingly, pressure is going to arise on the association between assessment and learning to take account of the rise of interest in learning technologies, and I've touched base with this already. Finally, a couple of words about the awarding body, and sorry, I skipped a slide. Oh, I've missed a slide, even better. Right, okay. Let's move forward then to the accreditation of competence. It needs to provide confidence in the quality of development and assessment of personnel. It needs to ensure that animal welfare is best supported. Should facilitate free movement of personnel between establishments, member states, and indeed more globally. It should improve the quality of science using live animals, and it should provide reassurance to the public, funders, regulators and others that the individual who has been certified in this way is in fact of a standard that is worthwhile having. So in summary then, an approval or a certification process needs to command the confidence of all players, trainers, trainees, and national authorities, and therefore it is likely to need to be an international process. There needs to be sustainable and consistent standards. The assessors need to be recognized as appropriately skilled and trained and competent. There needs to be independence, complete independence from the provider of training or the organization that provides training. And so the certification board can't draw its funds from these sources, although it's going to need money in order to make its activities proportionate and affordable. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to conclude for now and invite you to ask questions. Thank you very much for your attendance. Do we have any questions? Oh, I like silence, it's great. Okay. The first question I have here is, how would you certify something internationally rather than institutionally? The only way in which this can be done is for there to be an international agreement between areas where this competence needs to be recognized on the standards that are going to be used. And there would need to be an overarching body which would be responsible for the accreditation and certification process in both areas. In other words, if within the European context, it's perhaps easy to move forward because there's been the development of a European platform which effectively represents all of the member states of the European Union, and that body will set standards which accrediting bodies will need to apply. In other words, they're going to oversee a number of different accrediting bodies to ensure that there is a common standard. And that provides a mechanism for certifying the competence of individuals internationally. Please come back if I haven't answered that question to your satisfaction. Will copies of my presentation be available? Yes, I believe they will. The difference between competence and competency. Competency is a basic knowledge and skill to carry out a specific task. For example, you want an animal technician to be competent at cleaning out a mouse cage. You would expect them to have the knowledge and to have the technical skill to handle mice, to be able to do that in a satisfactory GLP appropriate way, or whatever it might be. The individual is not necessarily in a good position to deal with major emergencies. If a mouse escapes, you wouldn't necessarily expect somebody who is competent at doing that basic task to be able to assess how best to handle a mouse that's disappeared across the floor at high speed. And so that latter person requires somebody who is competent, who can say, right, this is what I need to do, and to get down and get that sorted out. So that's the distinction I'm drawing. Competency is a relatively basic set of skills and tasks, whereas competence is a much wider and more holistic thing. Can you define a description of the new European directive? There was one, I think, actually, or I gave a pointer to the website, and I'll just try and put that slide up again. I can find it. Excuse me, I'll just close that screen for a moment and try and find the slide that's got the web pointer. This one. Right, so you'll see then that the slide that I've just put up gives the website for the European directive. I apologize, it's a fairly long one. I hope that you can read it. But if not, if you Google for the directive 2010-63 EU, you will, I think, find it there. It's the output of one of the working groups. How do we get a copy of the slides and the presentation? I gather Don Cruikshank told me this is going to be on the website, so you will have access to that. And I believe also it will be available as a podcast. If somebody gets training, for example, the ALAS Learning Library, let me look at this question in full. No, sorry, I'm not seeing the full question. Are you saying that if somebody gets training from, for example, the ALAS Learning Library, that their ALAS qualification, or the ALAT, are we talking ALAT here, I think, that their qualification, I'm sorry, I can't read the whole question here. Can I skip that? If you could come back and give me some clarification, I'll try and answer it. There's a question here that ends in "and proficiency." Oh dear, I'm not making these questions out very clearly. How closely correlated are the developments in new technologies and techniques with relative competence? In fact, they're probably no worse than the more traditional methods. I'm not going to say that they're better, but there is an opportunity as the new learning methodologies move forward for assessments to incorporate, if you like, virtual reality scenarios, in which case it would be possible probably to get a better indication of how somebody will respond in an emergency than it would be in any other way. So I do envisage that in time, not at the present I think, but in time it will be possible for these new technologies to be even better than the traditional methods. But of course some of the benefits of e-learning and e-assessing technologies are already with us in terms of the ease of marking and helping students in the course of their learning development. Do you think that independence is an accreditation process, or in an accreditation process means that you have to pay for it? I'm afraid so. Everything comes with a cost. It may be that the cost is drawn up by national authorities who say, well, we need to set standards, or national regulatory bodies, or it may have to be borne by the individual. But in general, it tends to be not falling on the individual's shoulders at the present time. So I'm optimistic that the costs which are inevitably involved will be met from relatively neutral sources as far as the individual researcher is concerned, but not obviously as the establishment. How do you go about getting a company's internal training programs certified by the state, government, or whatever. A tricky one, but I think I'm talking above individual companies at this level. There are opportunities for organizations to, let's start with states first. There are opportunities for states to get together and set up common platforms. I think it would be helpful to FALASA if ALAS were to communicate with them and to open discussions to see what common ground there is between the two bodies. Now, I appreciate that ALAS is more concerned perhaps with the training of animal care staff at the present time than the training of scientists. But I also understand that other aspects of training are rising in priority, and it may well be that there's sharing at that level also. But when the European platform has already been established, it should be possible for an American input to that, or a Canadian, Australian, wherever it might be, and if you like, initially for a loose understanding of memorandum of understanding, if you like, all right, those are your standards, these are ours, can we come to a common ground? And then having come to a common ground, and that ought to be possible, then I think to move forward and say, right, we'll accredit and say this is accredited according to our particular standard, but our standard is matched against a broader standard elsewhere. So I do see a mechanism for it, although I do appreciate that it is not a straightforward process. The question again, if training is provided by ALAS's learning library, would you consider their certificate of completion valid? The problem with any scheming of this nature, including ALAS's learning library, is that it doesn't give me a great deal of information about the skills level of the individual who has completed the examination. There is obviously a statement from the person supervisor and so forth, but again, no consistency there, so I would be worried about the overall validity of such a process. And I think also it is assessing knowledge and some levels of understanding. The MCQ questions that are being used by the registration board are reasonably robust, but they don't go down to the deeper levels that I'm calling competency. And to be quite honest, much of what currently takes place doesn't go to those levels as well. So I do feel that we've got some distance to go with that yet, but good luck on the journey. I think it's a very important one. Okay, I think I've skipped through the questions. If I've missed anybody, I apologize. We've got 2 minutes left. Assessing professionalism. My approach to that is the 360-degree appraisal approach, if you like, the bird's eye view. Difficult to make it robust, very difficult to ensure that we've got all aspects covered, but it seems to me that if you're dealing with the supervisor or person, the line manager above, people from below, people from horizontally, you're much more likely to get a good view about the performance of that individual. In terms of assessing and issuing certificates of competence, there's some work to be done, I think, in making sure that the assessments that are done are uniform. Not impossible, there's a lot that can be done, because this is written information, and similarly if you're doing verbal presentations, they can be tape recorded or they digitally recorded, and an overall assessor can look at that and say, right, this balances. So I think there are ways forward, yes, but I do believe it's an important subject. It's something we're going to have to work at. Are we done? In which case, thank you to everybody. It's been a pleasant experience in some ways, and I wish you all a successful conference.